Section 25 of Mr. Rowl by D.K. Broster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ialin. Part 4. A Month of Miracles. Chapter 1. Several Discoveries. Quote, I perceived that I had every day more of his confidence. End quote. Rasselas, Chapter 40. The revelation that people are other than you had fancied them is always interesting, and only the practising cynic will demur to the opinion that they are very often found to be not worse, but better. On these lines, in the course of a couple of days, did Captain Hervey Barrington, R.N., and Capitaine Raoul de Sablières, 3e Hussars, make surprising discoveries about each other. Hervey's previous conviction about his captive was not so much that he was a wildcat of a pretty well unbreakable spirit, for he had enough acumen to allow for the part which circumstances had played in bringing out this quality, as that he was too histrionically gifted ever to be sincere. Raoul's main idea of Captain Barrington was not that of brutality incarnate, for he, on his side, was far too acute not to know how bitterly he had angered him, and to allow for wrath so intense, blazing suddenly out into savagery, but of someone hard and implacable as granite. Now Hervey, to his surprise, found himself in the company of a young man of a particularly sweet and gay temper, and of an engaging simplicity of demeanour. And somehow he knew that this was the fundamental, not the superficial, de Sablières. And Raoul, the discovery was rather slower, found in his ex-captor a remarkably feeling heart, which, for all his efforts, he could not disguise. It showed as he listened to the tale of Raoul's luckless adventures after he had scaled the roof, the recital of which was early drawn from the adventurer. It showed still more clearly a little later, when, on being questioned, Raoul revealed something of what he had been through in the hulks, and spoke of the scanty and often uneatable food, and the consequent perpetual hunger, of the swarming vermin, of which, since there was no soap and bathing was never allowed, the cleanest prisoner could not rid himself, of the poisonous atmosphere in which the captives slept, so foul that the guards who opened the portholes in the early morning always jumped hastily back to avoid the stench thus liberated, of the 6-foot square black hole at the bottom of the hold, ventilated merely by a few tiny apertures about the size of a sixpence, and visited by a sentry only once in 24 hours, and where men sometimes went mad or died, and of the callousness of certain of the officers. Worst of all was the terrible degradation of character which took place with so many of the inmates, forced association with whom was the chief misery of the place for any decent man. And Captain Barrington, walking in agitation about the room in which he had once taunted the speaker with the fate which awaited him on his return to the Ganges, could only say indignantly that he was sure the British public was unaware of these scandals, and that, if they only knew, his countrymen would insist on better conditions. With this belief, Raoul's experience of the English character led him to agree. Indeed, he gave it as his opinion that a great deal of the suffering in the hulks was quite contrary to the government's intentions, and due to the rascally contractors, who not only cheated the unfortunate prisoners of food and clothing, but swindled the Admiralty as well. The unpalatable truth about the hulks, however, was not the only shock to his racial self-esteem which Captain Barrington was destined to receive. Rather stiffly, being far from oblivious of the fact that he had once refused point-blank to listen to it, he next asked for the story of Raoul's initial misfortunes, and was given it, Miss Forrest's name alone being omitted, and she simply referred to as Mademoiselle. By the end of the tale of Sir Francis Mulholland's ingenuity, Captain Barrington was staring at the narrator, horror-struck. Oh, I could not have believed an English gentleman capable of such a dastardly action, he exclaimed. Not that I disbelieve you, de Sablières, he added hastily. Raoul, rather tired, lay and looked at him reflectively, wondering why he should now be as implicitly believed, as formerly he had been doubted. But to ask the Englishman why would only be to disconcert him still more. So he shut his eyes instead, and, without meaning to, fell asleep in that sudden uncontrollable fashion in which oblivion descended upon him nowadays. Since the interment of the Signora Thomas, however, he had been progressing steadily towards recovery, and that too ingenious lady's very tomb seemed forgotten now. But as for Mademoiselle Adrienne, it was not long before her impersonator was telling Hervey about the original. And there came a day when, to the surprise of both of them, even the ghost of the Signora stood between them and was proved harmless. It was Hervey who evoked her, and perhaps unintentionally. Surveying the convalescent critically one morning, ere he dropped into a chair by the bed, he observed, "I really think you're beginning to get a little flesh on your bones at last." "Oh, flesh!" exclaimed Raoul. "Mrs. Jeremy makes a prize cattle of me." "Oh, cattle is a plural noun, de Sablières," observed his host, smiling. "And that's the first time I've ever heard you make a real slip in your English. Except, of course, when you were—" For 1 second he paused, and then went on without a stagger. "When you were uttering the sentiments of the lady from Badajoz." "Yes," said Raoul, rather indistinctly, lowering his eyes. "Why did you make the Signora talk so?" pursued Hervey. Raoul shot a quick glance at him. Ma foi, je n'en sais pas trop. I think I could not help it. When I thought I was celle que vous savez, I found I could not speak English so well, that is all." Hervey's mouth twitched. "Well, before you impersonate her again, I advise you to take lessons, not indeed in English, but in Spanish." "And perhaps," suggested Raoul, with a penitent expression, "in truthfulness as well." "Oh, I'm afraid," returned Captain Barrington, "and that the Signora would never be closely acquainted with that virtue." "And yet," said her originator apologetically, "and she was not so untrue as you may think, sir. At least I have heard that some English ensign of the Light Brigade did marry a Spanish lady after you stormed Badajoz." "Oh, that tale was not pure romance, then. What regiment was he in?" "Oh, I do not know, sir. Not having met it in the field, I am ignorant of the composition of the Light Brigade." "Then you made a deuced good shot when you gazetted your hero into the 95th. Under his dark lashes, Raoul looked at the speaker with an indescribable mix of compunction and devilry. "Oh, pardon, Captain Barrington, but it was you who did that. I was very grateful, I assure you, for your suggestion." Hervey stared, and then broke into a laugh. "Yes, on my soul, you're right. It was my own suggestion to the damsel who seemed unaware of the difference between a regiment and a brigade. How she had parts, that lady." A corner of his sister's mantle fell upon him as he added, "Oh, it is to be hoped that the real ensign has not behaved as badly to his wife as your scoundrelly Thomas, of whom it seems I had the doubtful honour to remind you." Raoul grew red. No, he said, uncomfortably. "I'm sure he was not like you. But I was enraged, you see, when I said that." "Not without cause," interrupted Hervey, dropping his bantering tone. "And I don't mind admitting, de Sablières, that, afterwards, I admired your pluck for snatching the last word in the way you did that night. We had not left you any other weapon, I'm afraid." Raoul shook his head deprecatingly. "But of that, Thomas, I am ashamed. I had to tell you some story, it is true, though you never asked for one, but I wanted an excuse for sitting on the wall a little longer, out of those abominable shoes, and... Oh, you forgive me. I could not help enjoying the tale. Only when you said that I was really married, did I not enjoy it quite so much. And now you have avenged yourself 100 times by all this. He waved his available hand round the room. I think of it every day as I lie here, and I'm smitten to the heart. Oh, I wish you wouldn't think of it, then, said Hervey. Or read a book, or go to sleep when you feel like that. Oh, nobody wants you to. To behave like a girl, finished Raoul. He clapped his hand over his mouth. Oh la la, que je suis maladroit. And his face was so comical that Hervey laughed, too. With Mrs. Jeremy, of course, there'd never been any need for reconciliation or rapprochement. Had he not been her lamb and her property from the beginning? Raoul could not be ignorant of this gratifying fact, but so much the less could he be expected to divine her obstinate separation of his personality into two distinct entities, one of which was still repudiated by her. He discovered this mental peculiarity, however, one fine afternoon when, waking to find Madame Jérémie, as he had taken to calling her, sewing by the open window, he was inspired, after looking at her in silence for a little while, to ask in a far-away voice whether it was a dream, or whether it had really happened just now. "Has what happened, my dear?" inquired Mrs. Jeremy, putting down her work and looking over at him indulgently. Oh, perhaps he had been dreaming, poor young gentleman, that he was back with the mother for whom he used to cry out when he was ill. "You're kissing me," replied her patient, with an intensification of his rapt manner. "I'm afraid that it can only have been a dream. I only wish I could think." "Oh, as if I should ever do such a thing, Mr. Rowl," exclaimed Mrs. Jeremy, positively bridling. "How would it be so unpleasant an experience?" queried the young man, looking very innocent. "And now that Monsieur Jérémie shaves me so beautifully, oh, it is true that I'd much rather have been awake." Mrs. Jeremy took up her work again. "Oh, you talk a great deal too much nonsense, sir." "Oh, I know when you would not have kissed me," observed her tormentor. "When I had on that uncomfortable grey gown and the beautiful complexion. You would rather have slapped me, I think." Down went the sewing again. "Oh, don't speak about that baggage," ejaculated Mrs. Jeremy. "When I think of her and her brazen face, imposing on a good kind gentleman like the captain, my blood fairly boils." Raoul stared a moment, and then burst into laughter. "But, Madame Jérémie, it was I, all the time. You don't mean to say that you still think it was a real girl?" "I can assure you that my blood boils too, when I think of that meagre, if elegant, little meal you brought me up, when I could have eaten all that roast of the captain's, to which you so cruelly referred." "What I brought was quite enough for the young person," said Mrs. Jeremy stubbornly, resuming her sewing. "But no, it was not. I assure you that it was not. And it was all that she had to support her during her climb out of the window. Yes, and its insufficiency was probably the reason why she fell and broke her wrist. For this is her wrist, Madame Jérémie. Oh, come, you cannot really disbelieve me. And if I'm not the lady, where did she go to? What of Captain Barrington's reputation?" "Oh, I don't wish to discuss that hussy," declared Mrs. Jeremy. "Oh, but it's not in human nature to believe—" She broke off abruptly and stood up as Captain Barrington himself appeared in the doorway. "Oh, yes, sir, he's awake. Oh, please to come in, sir, if you wish." Yet if, apparently, it was impossible for Mrs. Jeremy to concede the same identity to the fevered and half-drowned young man whom she had put to bed in the spare room on that Friday evening, and the painted hussy who had vanished from the same apartment on the previous Wednesday night, there was one subject on which her credulity was unlimited, and that was Boney and his doings. She would swallow any libel against that bugbear of the English nation, on discovering which Raoul naturally exercised his wits in finding food for so entertaining a propensity. One morning he had imperceptibly led her to the point where she exclaimed, "Oh, and so people don't get married in France nowadays, and there being no churches left, and no clergymen." For 20 years ago she had heard of émigré priests, but of the Concordat of 1802 never. Raoul was pleased, because now he could administer a greater shock. "Oh no, you're quite wrong there, Madame Jérémie. One does marry, a great deal. My last wife." Mrs. Jeremy, the most sure-handed of women, dropped the broom she was wielding. "Your wife? Your last wife? How didn't you know that I was married?" asked Raoul with elaborate carelessness. "Why not? I'm nearly 25. The reasonableness of this consideration further disconcerted his victim. "But," she protested, remembering, "you were married before, you say. You have been a widower already, at your age." "Oh, no," said the young man, gazing at the ceiling. "I'm glad to say I was never that. And indeed," he added thoughtfully, "even if one of them had died, I could hardly describe myself as widowed, because there would always remain the other two. You see, we are allowed 3. "3 what?" demanded Mrs. Jeremy, her head turning. 3 wives. It is the Emperor's wish." Mrs. Jeremy sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "Mr. Rowl." "Oh, I dare say you don't believe me," went on Raoul, with an air of great candour. "But I will tell you all about my wives, if you wish. I wonder that I've not mentioned them before, for I'm very fond of them all. Julie and Anastasie, and Claudine, the newest one. It is true that I've not seen any of them for nearly 3 years, and it is possible that by now some of them, if not all, have been confiscated." "Confiscated?" breathed his listener. "Well, you see," explained the romancer, wondering how far he could go. "There's the future population of France to consider. That, of course, is why the Emperor wishes. And one cannot complain if one is absent so long. I dare say I shall easily find some more. But I should like to tell you about Claudine." Mrs. Jeremy rose to her feet. "Mr. Rowl," she said in strong indignation, "I can't but think that you are jesting. If not, all I can say is, well, really, I'd rather not discuss it with you." And indeed, she was quite red. "Oh, but don't you want to hear about Claudine?" asked the invalid, with an ingratiating smile. "She had the most beautiful—" "Oh, I'd Claudine her," said Mrs. Jeremy. "And you, too, you young jackanapes, if I thought it was true. 3. "Oh, Madame Jérémie, that's not respectful," said Raoul lazily. "And surely Bonaparte's wishing me to have 3 wives is not as disgraceful as his habit of eating children. And you know that is true, don't you?" "Oh, get along with you," responded Mrs. Jeremy, breathing a sigh of relief as her lamb's guile was revealed. "Oh, making game of me like that. I don't believe you are married at all, and I pity your wife when you do get one." "My ideal wife," began Raoul unrepressed, "would be the lady with the wig who—" But Mrs. Jeremy went out and shut the door. And while he was still smiling to himself over his late success, Captain Barrington's tread and that of the doctor were audible outside, and his thoughts were diverted from the subject, not altogether pleasantly, by Mr. Touchwood's unbandaging and manipulating his wrist, though he managed to keep up during the operation almost his usual flow of persiflage, desiring to know, for instance, whether, supposing the wrist remained stiff in perpetuity, it would gradually turn into a fossil. For he always expressed a great wish to be instructed in geology. "One thing that won't easily turn into a fossil, young man," replied Mr. Touchwood, "is your tongue, I fancy. Or your spirit, either," he added, as he finished rebandaging. "There, I shan't have to hurt you like that again, I hope. And when may I get up?" "All in good time," responded Mr. Touchwood, as he generally did to this query. There was, however, one person in the household who was not subjugated by the young man upstairs, and that was John Jeremy, late captain's coxswain of the Suffolk. He was not hostile, but he was bewildered and inclined to be injured. Why Captain Barrington had turned round as he had, running himself thereby into a danger which still threatened him, was a complete mystery. It seemed, too, as if the young beggar had done nothing but get him into hot water, from the time when his master had called him to account in the Kestrel for hurting the blessed wildcat when he saved him from drowning himself. And secretly John Jeremy, though not inhumane, thought it would be better for all parties if he had succeeded in his attempt. Down to yesterday, when Hannah had given him the rough side of her tongue because the razor had slipped when he was shaving his lordship. For John Jeremy still performed that office, and performed it with much of the immense solemnity and subdued nervousness of the first occasion of all, when he had said humbly to the young man against the pillows, "Oh, I asks pardon if I've not done it well, sir. Me not being used to shaving the captain, as always shaves hisself, nor I haven't never shaved a gentleman in bed before." But Raoul, who had never set out to subjugate anybody, had no desire to wean the seaman from his rightful allegiance. He guessed quite well why the good mariner looked upon him with distrust, and bethought the better of him for it. It was because Jeremy knew that a French prisoner's presence at Fairhaven was a standing menace to his master. Raoul could not forget it either. This house, which was heaven after the past, could not harbour him for ever. And what if Captain Barrington did have to pay dearly for his generosity? The thought tormented him at times, yet he was still bedridden and could not get away. Moreover, since he had not been traced here 3 weeks ago, why should he be traced now, when he was drowned and forgotten? Thus Captain Barrington, when he had broached the question to him. But the possibility was there. Another trouble was that from beneath Captain Barrington's roof he dared not write to Juliana Forrest as he longed to do. Not that he imagined she would be anxious about him. Creedy, he knew, would soon acquaint her with the news of his escape, if only to get the residue of the money which, he had informed the fugitive, was now due. Raoul had tried in vain to find out what was the total sum expended, having a firm intention of repaying it somehow. And as Miss Forrest had, most evidently, abandoned her siege en règle of the transport office, she would not have heard of his supposed drowning. It was unlikely to be in the newspapers, and even if it had come to Creedy's ears, he would not be very anxious to pass on the fact to her. No, he longed to write to Miss Forrest for other reasons. But not having Creedy's facilities for private communication, he could not do it, lest the letter should fall into the wrong hands. So, since he could not tell her what he felt, he thought of her the more. And about Captain Barrington he thought continually. Why he had done what he had done, for his sake. Why he now believed what he, Raoul, said. Why he was not married. Why he was on leave so long, in wartime. He had tried to discover the last from Jeremy, and Jeremy had replied, quite snappily for him. A man must have a rest sometime, even from sinking of French ships. Further, why his face in repose was so stern and sad. Rowl decided in the end that Captain Barrington had a secret grief. How probably he loved, or had loved, in vain. The lady had married another, was dead, had eloped, had jilted him at the altar. He longed to question Mrs. Jeremy on the point, but delicacy restrained him. He did not, however, feel any hesitation in questioning the good lady about that half-mythical sister of Captain Barrington's, who was so largely responsible for his present situation. What nobody at Fairhaven realized was that Miss Barrington would shortly be at hand to answer for herself, since, for reasons of her own, she was shortening her stay at Exeter by a full 6 days. Thus she descended upon Fairhaven, en route for her own home on the other side of the river, 6 days before she was expected there. Hervey, indeed, had not been thinking about her return at all. The 10 days which had passed since his prisoner and he had shaken hands, having given him more immediate occupation. Aware of her departure from plan, Miss Barrington was therefore neither hurt nor surprised to find, when she arrived at her brother's door, that he was out, and Mrs. Jeremy likewise. She was conscious of a strange, but surely erroneous, impression that Jeremy had no great desire to admit her. At least he displayed no alacrity about the business. But then John Jeremy was never instinct with that quality, and he scratched his head with a puzzled air as he looked at her baggage. "Be you going to stay, ma'am?" "Yes, a night or so," responded Miss Lavinia. "Unless there's any reason why I should not," she added. "You've not, I trust, got smallpox in the house?" "Oh, smallpox? Lord, no, Miss Barrington. Whoever said so?" exclaimed Jeremy, looking alarmed. And then, gathering by the visitor's face that the query was not meant seriously, he added, but without a smile, "I'll bring your portmanteau to your room in a minute or two, ma'am. For, if you'll excuse me, I've got summat to see to in the kitchen, Hannah being out." And, eyeing her again with that slow, curious, half-distrustful look, he vanished. "Oh, Jeremy is becoming a cook," thought Miss Barrington as she went upstairs, "and culinary cares are weighing upon his spirits." Miss Barrington's bedroom at Fairhaven was supposed to be ready for occupation at half an hour's notice, and since Mrs. Jeremy was out, Miss Lavinia took off her bonnet and cloak, and herself began to remove the shrouds from the furniture. And thus employed, she soon detected that something was missing from the room. The little inlaid table by the bed, which Hervey had brought her as a present from Spain. What an odd thing! And yet perhaps not so odd, after all, considering the confusion in this room at her last visit. What had become of that unfortunate young Frenchman, the cause of its disorganization? She had often thought of his fate during the last 3 weeks, but she had seen nothing in the newspaper, and had not received any letter from Hervey. Perhaps he had got clear away, as she could not but hope. And no, she was not going to submit to being deprived, for no reason, of her little Spanish table, and, if Hannah had taken it into the spare bedroom, she would soon have it out again. So Miss Barrington went resolutely through the powdering closet, the fatal powdering closet, to investigate, remembering as she went her previous incursion into the spare bedroom, and what had met her eyes when she got there. It becomes, therefore, a question for psychologists whether her mental preoccupation with her former shock tended to heighten or to alleviate her second one. Miss Lavinia herself inclined afterward to the first alternative. At all events, so she averred later to her brother, she staggered and clutched her hand to her head like any heroine of romance, and her heart stopped beating. How absolutely ceased, my dear Hervey. And I said, aloud, I believe, how good God, am I going mad? And is that to be my end? For there, but this time well in the bed, not on it, there he was again, the same young scamp, lying motionless in something the same attitude, save that today she could see more than his profile. And there was a vagabond table by the bedside, laden with a glass, a spoon, a bottle or two, a portion of jelly, and, rosily ensconced on a mat of their own leaves, 2, or more correctly, 1.5, of Hervey's incomparable nectarines, those nectarines for which duchesses might have sued in vain, and of which she, his dear and only sister, received a bare half-dozen in the course of the summer. Their presence here was as astounding and as eloquent as that of the runaway. If Hervey gave him those... As once before, Miss Lavinia ventured nearer. The occupant of the bed was sound asleep. Again. Yet he was not quite the young man of her first discovery, who had looked thin and tired indeed, but not wasted or transparent. Since she last saw him, Hervey's wildcat visitant had clearly been very ill. Oh, but how in the name of fortune? Deciding that, if not insane already, she certainly would soon become so unless she took steps to obtain information, Miss Barrington crept from the room in search of Jeremy, the door not being locked this time, and met him mounting the stairs, carefully carrying, not her baggage, but a covered bowl on a tray. "Oh, stop, Jeremy," she said imperiously. "You can put down that turtle soup, or peacock's tongues, or whatever it is, for a moment. He's fast asleep. But if you don't tell me how he got here again, and what has happened, you may as well order a coach and four for Bedlam at once." Every time that Raoul came to his senses in this pleasant room, this heavenly bed, these lavender-scented sheets, it was a fresh shock of bliss to him. Yes, once again he was really here in decency and comfort, and not... He moved, gave a little sigh of utter contentment, and then became aware that the door-handle was turning, somewhat hesitatingly. He remembered that he was for an hour or so under the guardianship of Jeremy, and that Jeremy was always rather timid in discharging this function, and required encouragement. "Come in, Palinurus," he said, for it pleased him to air what remained of his classical knowledge on one quite incapable of appreciating it, and who, though it had been explained to him that this appellation was the name of a Trojan pilot, remained quite unaffected by its, as Raoul considered, extraordinary appropriateness. But there came in instead a very handsome grey-haired lady bearing a bowl on a tray. Raoul flushed up to the roots of his hair, that hair which, as he was instantly and painfully conscious, must be extremely untidy. Shaved he had been that morning, by Palinurus, but he felt in no state to receive a strange lady. "I must apologize for intruding," said the newcomer in a very pleasant voice, as she set down the bowl by the jelly and the nectarines. "I hope you will allow me to replace John Jeremy till his spouse returns. I'm Lavinia Barrington, Captain Barrington's sister, of whom I think you must have heard when you were here before, though you may have doubted her existence." The rather hollow grey eyes went over her, and a little smile came into them. "We were to have met in the garden that evening, I think," murmured their owner. "I hope, madame, that you are so kind as to excuse my present condition. I did not know that I was to have the honour." "Oh, nobody knew," said Miss Barrington frankly, "least of all myself. And now, about the soup. You're ready for it. Can you manage with that bandaged wrist? And then, I think, a little rearrangement of pillows first." She tucked them under him. "Was that how Mrs. Jeremy does it? There, can you hold the bowl, so?" And she sat herself down to watch the consumption of its contents. "What is the stuff like? Can Jeremy cook?" "Ah, I expect it is really of Hannah's compounding." "Oh, it tastes indeed like the soups of Mrs. Jeremy," replied the invalid, lifting his eyes from it. "She cooks divinely. Miss Barrington, I'm spoiled in this house. Oh, you cannot figure to what an extent. Not to speak of owing Captain Barrington my life." "Oh, tut," said Miss Lavinia. "You came very near owing him the opposite, I fancy. Or rather, how do you know, my dear young man, that I am the cause of all your troubles, as a woman generally is of a man's?" Raoul seemed to ponder this. A trace of a smile appeared. It had a kind of secret quality. Then he observed politely, "I hope that I should welcome anything at the hands of a lady," and addressed himself once more to the bowl. "Oh, your nation has always been gallant," observed Miss Lavinia, smiling in her turn. "But I assure you that the coals of fire which you are preparing to heap on my head have already been preceded by the ashes of penitence. In other words, I was afterwards extremely sorry that I had betrayed you to my brother. but a woman's repentance always comes too late. Haven't you found it so, Mr. Rowl?" "I? No," said the young man, momentarily taken aback. "I've not made any philosophic reflections on the subject. How do you think, then, Miss Barrington, that it is better not to repent at all?" "For a woman, perhaps, since the result is always so ineffectual," pronounced his visitor. "Ah, no, not always," said Raoul quickly. "No, I cannot allow that." And he finished the soup. "And have you made any philosophic reflections about a man's repentance?" inquired Miss Lavinia, as she took the empty bowl from him. And there was certainly meaning in her tone this time, and Raoul coloured faintly. "No," he said, his eyes lighting up. "Those are cold things, reflections. For undeserved goodness one has only gratitude." "Well, this is all very extraordinary," thought Miss Lavinia, "and I don't wonder that Jeremy could give me no coherent account of what has been taking place. Of course, Hervey has the best heart in the world, but still—" "My brother has gone to Taunton, I hear," she remarked, casting a side glance on the symbolic nectarines. "Yes, he has the goodness to do a commission for me, and to buy me some clothes," said Raoul, with half-concealed elation. "And tomorrow I am to get up for a little." "Oh, more clothes!" exclaimed Miss Barrington. "You reject, then, that elegant grey gown of which you were so careful, mademoiselle?" The young man in the bed gave her a look which said so much that Miss Lavinia's heart warmed toward him. With a little further acquaintance, they would understand each other perfectly. "Oh, I regret that I never saw you in it," she went on. "Oh, perhaps some day. I believe that I have it in my room still. I've half a mind to get it." "Oh, but you must not let Mrs. Jeremy see it," said Raoul, smiling. "It might give her a coup de sang, that costume." "Oh, I trust, then, that she's not made away with it," said Miss Lavinia. "Oh, I would never forgive her." She got up with her surprising ease of movement, and went incontinently through the closet into her own room. She had to open and shut a good many drawers in the chest where she had laid the dress and wig the morning after the battle, and in the middle of her search suddenly heard Hervey's voice in the other room. "Ah, my sister is not here, then." Did he not sound relieved? "But you will have her and Mrs. Jeremy fighting over your body now, I expect, my boy. Have you slept at all this afternoon?" "Yes, thank you, sir," replied the invalid, while Miss Barrington caught her breath. My boy! And Hervey's tone! And the young Frenchman's when he answered him. Miracles had been going forward in that room. And by even that brief contemplation of them, she deprived herself of the mischievous pleasure of having her first meeting with her repentant brother in the presence of his former victimizer and victim, for by the time she got through the cupboard, the bedroom door had shut behind him. End of section 25. Section 26 of Mr. Rowl by D.K. Broster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Eileen. Part 4, Chapter 2. Juliana's Immortelles. Quote, "The princess and her favourite embraced each other with transport too violent to be expressed, and went out together to pour the tears of tenderness in secret, and exchange professions of kindness and gratitude." End quote. Rasselas, Chapter 38. The sun of the September afternoon poured cheerfully into Hervey Barrington's meticulously tidy dressing-room, where he was changing into riding clothes. He was going to Taunton on business, not by coach this time. Yesterday Lavinia had returned to her cottage, having stayed 4 days at Fairhaven. Hervey had observed to her that it was clear why she had prolonged her visit beyond the couple of nights for which he was usually privileged to entertain her, and asked how Mrs. Jeremy had borne this preoccupation with her especial property. "Mrs. Jeremy's property?" queried his sister, flashing at him one of her quick glances. "Isn't he rather yours, Hervey?" "It is I, certainly, who am responsible for him, if that is what you mean," Captain Barrington had replied. But it was not what she meant, and he knew it, and even now a smile curved his resolute mouth as, having settled his stock before the mirror, he went to the window and looked out. His dressing-room was one of the few rooms in Fairhaven which overlooked the little walled fruit garden at the side of the house. However, it was not his espaliers that he was contemplating now. On the plot of grass in the middle was a couch, and by it a book lying face downwards. But the occupant of the couch was at this moment standing meditatively in front of a laden plum-tree, which was displaying its treasures against the warm stone of the wall. Raoul called this little fruit-ringed garden his parc, or sheepfold, for here he and his sofa had been installed for the last 2 afternoons, on condition that he never strayed out of the enclosure. He was under engagement not even to return to the house without first ascertaining that the coast was clear. But so successfully had his presence at Fairhaven been concealed that, beyond taking certain obvious precautions, one did not trouble much about the prospect of discovery. From his window, Hervey watched the selection of 2 of the ripest plums, and the convalescent's slow return with them to his couch, on which he stretched himself out luxuriously. Exactly a month today since he had been smuggled into this house. How Hervey was going to get him away when he was fit for it, he had not yet thought out. He only knew that he had no desire to hasten that moment. How odd that seemed. He left the window, and had drawn on one riding-boot, when there was a knock, and Mrs. Jeremy appeared, announcing that a lady and gentleman from London desired to see him on business, and were at this moment in the morning-room. She held out a tray, and Hervey, taking up the cards which lay thereon, read with puzzled eyes the names of Viscount Fulgrave and the Honourable Juliana Forrest. It was not hope which had brought Juliana to Stowey. She had been driven here, after 24 haunted, miserable days, by the longing to hear on the spot what details were known of the tragedy witnessed, as she gathered, by the coastguards, and if Monsieur de Sablières' body had by this time been recovered, to be sure that it had had fitting burial. For in his death, as in the last painful months of a short life, she felt that she was the only person in England to care for him. Yet, on the other hand, the very shortness of that life was due to her initial waywardness, which had set in motion the whole fatal train of events, as the unthinking loosening of a pebble may end by causing a whole cliff wall to slide downward in an avalanche of disaster. So acute and so persistent was her distress that her father finally snatched at any method of alleviating it, and though he thought the present method both morbid and inconvenient, for he had threatenings of gout at the moment, he offered to take her down to Stowey on this melancholy errand. They had arrived this afternoon, and made their way to the coastguard station, only to be told, in the soft Devon tongue, that it was not the coastguards, but Captain Barrington, up to Fairhaven, who had seen the Frenchman drown, and that no, the body had not come ashore yet, likely never would. So to Fairhaven they had come. And in the pleasant casemated room, where she was to hear the last act of the tragedy she had written, Juliana sat and wondered whether this old retired naval captain, such her father had said he must certainly be, would show annoyance at their coming, would refuse details, or give too many. And as she heard the door handle turn, she felt a sudden doubt of her courage, a sudden wonder at her temerity. Compared to the veteran she had expected, the somewhat stern, good-looking man who came in was young. But young or old, those eyes had seen Raoul de Sablières die, and she could not take her own from him all the time that her father made themselves and their errand known, and asked Captain Barrington for details. The body, I gather, has not been recovered," he finished. For all her mental anguish, Juliana could not avoid noticing the colour which mounted, at that, to Captain Barrington's face. "No," he said, a little indistinctly. I doubt if there's now any chance of it." He turned away, for he had not sat down, and murmuring something about a draught, closed the casement window. Then, fixing a very clear and steady pair of eyes on Lord Falgrave, he said, "You were sincerely interested in this young man, my lord." "Oh, sincerely," replied his lordship, with a glance at his daughter. "I did my best to obtain his release from the hulks. Had he not escaped and lost his life in so doing, I should have succeeded, for it appears that he had rendered a signal service to a British officer at Albuera, and the Transport Board were prepared to recommend him for an unconditional cartel. But now, of course—" "A cartel!" exclaimed Captain Barrington in evident astonishment. "Oh, he would have been released altogether." "That was certainly intended. He had saved the life of this officer, a major in the 3rd Foot. But before the commissioners could take the necessary steps came the melancholy news of the young man's death." Oh, why did Captain Barrington look so strange, so much more than merely surprised? But Juliana's eyes, in her pain, wandered at last away from his face, only to encounter a sharper pang. From where she sat she could see the wide river that had drowned Mr. Rowl, all blue and sparkling under the September sky. Now she did not want to hear those details she had come to hear. It hurt too deeply. How she cared too much. More than she knew. Oh, why had she come? You astonish me very much," she heard Captain Barrington saying, and then he seemed to come to a stop. "Oh, it is indeed very regrettable that the young man should no longer be alive to profit by this favour," observed her father. "You're quite sure, my lord, that it really would have been extended to him had he lived? Oh, forgive my pertinacity." "From what I was told, sir, I feel convinced of it." "Oh, then," began Captain Barrington, and stopped again. Suddenly he put a curious question. "Oh, my lord, are you disposed to admit that there may be occasions when a man's duty to his country conflicts with the claims of humanity?" "I suppose there may be such occasions," replied his lordship cautiously. "Then, if, in the case of this young Frenchman, who is reported to have been drowned—" "Reported?" interjected Lord Falgrave. "But was it not you yourself, Captain Barrington, who reported it? Was your report then based only on hearsay?" "Yes, I did report it," admitted Captain Barrington. "But—" He hesitated, and a spasm of relief darted through Juliana. He meant that he had not, after all, witnessed the tragedy with his own eyes. And, after all, she need not hear of it. But the speaker was going on again. "If I were to tell you, Lord Falgrave," he said squarely, "that this young Frenchman had been rescued, hidden and cared for through a serious illness by an Englishman who ought no doubt to have made him over to the authorities, but who could not bring himself to do this, what would be your opinion of that man?" But Lord Falgrave had no opportunity of stating his opinion, for his daughter was on her feet, stretching out a hand to Harvey Barrington. "How is it true, sir?" she implored. "Is it true, or only a possibility, that he's not—" Harvey turned to her. "It is quite true, madam," he replied soberly. "He is alive, and—" It was he who caught Miss Forrest as she swayed, transferring her quickly to her father's care, and ringing the bell violently for Mrs. Jeremy. Then supervened a period of the attentions of that good lady and smelling salts. At one moment, and there was even borne to Harvey's nostrils, he having discreetly turned his back, the odious smell of burnt feathers. and during the time that he thus contemplated the kestrel at her moorings, he lost any remaining doubts as to Miss Forrest's identity. She was, of course, the unnamed lady of Raoul's story, and it seemed hardly necessary for it to be apologetically whispered into his ear by her father, as it presently was, that the news of the young man's being alive after all had proved too much for her, she having taken the sad affair so much to heart. Swoon and explanation, however, confirmed him in his resolve to remove the veil from his own conduct, or misconduct. He could not keep Raoul from these good friends of his, and from the prospect of release, because of the possibility of risk to himself. At last Miss Forrest, apologizing for her foolishness and the trouble she had caused, and declining Mrs. Jeremy's suggestion that she should repose herself in Miss Barrington's bedroom, appeared fully recovered, and Hervey caught her whisper, "Oh, ask him, Papa. Ask him how, and where, and who." And Lord Falgrave obediently approached him. "Will you tell us the rest, sir? Who, for instance, is the man you spoke of, who showed so much charity? You need not be afraid of our ever breathing a word about his humanity." Hervey Barrington had turned round. "Thank you, my lord, for the assurance. Since the man in question wears His Majesty's uniform, he is doubly grateful for it. He has the honour of speaking to you at this moment." Never in his life had he made so dramatic an announcement. "Oh, you, sir!" exclaimed Lord Falgrave. "Then you did not see him drown. You saved him." "Yes," said Hervey, rather curtly. "He did not love the histrionic. What else would you have a man do?" "Oh, quite so. But you appear to have done a good deal more than that." "Captain Barrington, I should esteem it a privilege." He held out his hand. "Oh, this is a felon's hand, my lord," said Hervey, and for the first time he smiled. "Oh, tut, tut," said the condemner of Creedy, and he wrung it. "And are we to understand that you have the young man still here, under your roof?" "Oh, well, he's actually in the garden at this moment. I will have him summoned, or perhaps—" He hesitated. "Oh, I think you said, sir," put in Juliana, leaning forward, "that he had been ill." "Yes, very ill, and he's still weak, though quite well again. If, therefore, his lordship would give himself the trouble to come with me into the garden, the stairs being somewhat trying to a convalescent. Yet, doubtless, Miss Forrest, too, would wish." He looked from one to the other. Yes, Miss Forrest did wish, and announced herself as perfectly able to accompany her father to the garden. Indeed, she had now the most lovely colour, so Hervey gave her his arm. And as they left the house, she said to him in a low voice, "Oh, Captain Barrington, I hardly dare let myself believe it. Yet, since it must be true, how is one ever to thank you?" "By not saying a word about my action to anyone, Miss Forrest," replied Hervey Barrington, and lifted the latch of the little door in the wall. "Raoul," said Hervey's deep voice, penetrating a very fleeting dream, "here are 2 visitors to see you. Don't move. They will excuse your not rising." He stood back, and Raoul opened his eyes, half sleepy, half startled, and saw who one of them was. The colour rushed over his face. He made an inarticulate sound, and tried to get off the couch. Oh, but her companion! Oh, he must still be half asleep. It could not really be Lord Wellington, and prevented this disobedience by coming close and holding out his hand. "Oh, how do you do, sir? I am exceedingly glad to learn that you're not drowned, as we thought. And here is my daughter, who is in the same case. We came to lay a wreath on your grave, and find, most happily, that there's no necessity—" "Oh, sir! Oh, my lord!" stammered Raoul, utterly confused and dizzy. Whether this tall gentleman with a nose were real, or a remnant of a dream, she was real, and was looking at him with a little rainbow of a smile. How could he answer coherently, or speak to anyone else, or even to her? And she said nothing, but only looked at him with that heavenly kindness. Hervey had by now brought up a rustic chair. "I'll sit down, my dear," said the gentleman, and Juliana obeyed. "Oh, perhaps I ought to introduce myself," he went on, to the young man, "for your good friend here probably does not know that I have not previously had the pleasure of meeting you, though indeed you've been much in my thoughts these last months. I'm Lord Falgrave." Again Raoul tried to get out thanks. Again he failed to produce anything coherent. But Lord Falgrave by no means waited for either. "And I may give myself the satisfaction of telling you, sir," he pursued, "since you're fortunately still alive, that I've been able, by following up a happy suggestion of my daughter's, based on something you once told her, to procure. However, I think she shall inform you of that herself." He seemed in high good humour, as indeed he was, on Juliana's account. "I see that you have some fine espaliers over there, Captain Barrington. Fruit growing greatly interests me." Hervey said something, and their voices receded, died out of the garden altogether. Between these 4 fruit-laden walls, under the blue roof, there was only Juliana Forrest, who had come all this way to see him. She had on a muslin gown, the colour of an apricot, with little silver lines. She was not looking at him now, and a silence had fallen. Was she thinking of the close of their last meeting? As if he should ever presume on that angelic gift of hers. He slipped off the couch onto one knee, took her hand, and bending his head kissed it passionately, without words. "For more than 3 weeks I've believed you drowned," said Juliana, in a little thread of a voice, and trembling. "Oh, I only heard just now, and the joy, and the relief." She turned her head away, and put up her free hand to her eyes. "Oh, you thought that," said Raoul in deep distress. "I hoped. I was almost sure you would not hear it. I have longed to write to you, but there was Captain Barrington's safety to consider." Juliana Forrest turned her head back, careless that 2 tears were coursing down her face. And seeing him still kneeling there, so thin and altered, "Oh, please, please, Monsieur de Sablières, lie down again. Oh, indeed you should. Oh, to please me." To please her, he would at least sit upon the couch. And indeed he felt a strange swimming in the head. Notre Dame de Bon Secours had come to visit him, or come to bury him. And perhaps he was dead and in paradise already. Only that seemed unlikely. But here certainly was a denizen of heaven. And he must address her. "I'm grieved indeed that you should have heard that," he said again, and stole another long look at her. "Oh, but are you really?" asked a little voice within him. If she had not heard it, she would not, probably, be here. "Oh, how did you learn it, mademoiselle? Surely it was not in the newspapers." If Raoul was a prey to varied emotions, his visitor had to control even more varied. He whom less than an hour ago she was mourning as dead was alive, and was here within reach of her hand, and she had great news for him. Also, the last time they had met, she had... But in presence of matters so much more vital, that memory had scarcely room to raise its head and make her blush. "No, it was not in the newspapers," she answered. "I heard, because... Oh, Monsieur de Sablières, I've good news for you, and the prospect of a cartel." "What?" exclaimed Raoul, gripping the edge of the couch. "Oh, it is true," said Juliana seriously. "But for your escape, my doing, you might be in France today. Even now, I suppose, it only needs your identification by this officer, and the transport office will recommend you for it." "Identification?" stammered the young man, his head whirling. "What officer?" "The officer whose life you saved at Albuera. Major Brackenbury of the Buffs." "But I never heard his name. And you, mademoiselle, how did you know anything about him?" His amazement was very sweet to Juliana. At last she had accomplished on his behalf something that was not merely reparation. "That day by the stream," she began, looking at him with a really radiant smile. And with that told him the whole story of the quest of Major Brackenbury and his gratitude. "Oh, my God," said Raoul, gazing at her almost stupefied. "And you have done that for me, that too." But, after all, Juliana had been too lately and too long under the shadow of the misfortunes which she had brought upon him so easily to forget them. She looked away, and it was with rather an unsteady voice that she said, "Whatever I do, I can never make up for the harm I've caused you. Even if you shortly receive your freedom, as I hope you will, nothing can give you back these last months, or make up to you for what you've suffered, through my doing. All your life you will remember that the folly of an English girl sent you to that, and that her unexampled courage and devotion saved me from it again," said Raoul, "more than saved me. Oh, Miss Forrest, if you could only know how you appear to me, you would cease to torment yourself with this unnecessary remorse. You bring me this great gift, return to my own country, and you think I can have room in my heart for the shadow of a reproach. À vrai dire," he added, and his voice sank, "I think that in my heart at this moment there's room for only one feeling, wonder at your incredible goodness in coming all this way to ask the last tidings of a poor prisoner who had crossed your path. If I were the ghost I might be, mademoiselle, and saw you standing at my grave, and though I knew, as I do know, living, that you'd spent so much time, so much effort, so much gold to help me, still the Immortelles in your hand would outweigh all else. You've come yourself, when you did not even know that I had a tongue to thank you." With an emotion so contagious as this, Juliana had never before been in contact. She turned a little pale. "You exaggerate, I think, Monsieur de Sablières," she said, in a rather troubled voice. "And let us discuss now how we are to proceed about the cartel. If you were to come back with my father and me to London—" "I'll come back with you!" exclaimed Raoul, as if he had not heard aright. "Oh, you think it would not be safe?" asked Juliana, mistaking his tone. "Oh, but you have only to prove your identity. You're practically a pardoned man." Would it be safe? In a different sense. To sit by her side for 2 days, to sleep under the same roof. It might be intoxicating, but would it be safe? Yet, had it meant Huntingdon jail, he would do it, if he were really to have the chance of it. "I will discuss it with my father," Juliana was going on. "It seems to me that it would be the best plan." She rose. "I think I hear him returning. We might come again tomorrow to see you about it. We're staying at the Dolphin. And I've so much to hear. You've been ill and nursed here by Captain Barrington. Not only ill, I see, but injured." Raoul had bent his head. Why must she go? But if she came again tomorrow, perhaps he could bear that this should end. "Yes, I've a great deal to tell you about Captain Barrington and what I owe to him. And a great deal to hear, too, if I may. It amazes me that you can have found that officer. And it was nothing, what I did. Are you sure it is not a mistake?" Juliana shook her head. "Major Brackenbury did not call it nothing, I assure you." "Yes, Papa, I'm ready." And Raoul walked in a dream beside her to the garden door, where Lord Falgrave and his host were standing. Lord Falgrave shook his hand. "Oh, I'm sorry to see that sling, sir," he remarked. "But I hope it will be many a day before you have your foot in one, which is where mine will be tomorrow, I'm afraid. Gout. "Oh, in that case," said Raoul, "how can I express my sense of your lordship's goodness in taking this journey?" "I'm very glad I did," responded his lordship, looking at him kindly. "Yes, tomorrow, Captain Barrington, we will discuss ways and means for getting this young gentleman his due." "I shall have pleasure in waiting upon you, my lord, as I suggested," replied Hervey, and was instantly aware of a hard, almost vicious grip on his arm from behind. "Or," he added hastily, "in welcoming you here." "Yes, that would admit of a full council of war," responded Lord Falgrave, "and provided that my enemy has not attacked me. Until tomorrow, then, Monsieur de Sablières." "Oh, but you mustn't show yourself yet, you know, my dear boy," said Hervey quietly, putting a hand on Raoul's shoulder, for the latter was manifesting every intention of escorting Miss Forrest to the carriage. "On my faith, I was forgetting," said Raoul, a trifle taken aback. "No, I suppose not. Au revoir, then, mademoiselle." It was as he raised her hand to his lips that the full memory of their last parting came like a tide upon Juliana, dyeing her face for a moment. Oh, heaven grant he were not thinking of it too! But surely the news she had brought must have obliterated the recollection. She went to the carriage hugging that quite illusory consolation. End of section 26. Section 27 of Mr. Rowl by D.K. Broster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Elin. Part 4, Chapter 3. Relinquishing a Dream. Quote, "At last he began to fear lest they should be discovered. He therefore took passage in a ship to Suez." End quote. Rasselas, Chapter 15. When Hervey came back from escorting the visitors to their carriage, the occupant of the pack was still standing just inside the garden door like a man in a trance. Hervey smiled at him. "Well, Raoul." "I'm still rather overwhelmed," confessed Raoul, and he looked it. "Her coming like this, and the cartel. Have you heard of that? It's like a conte de fées." Hervey slipped his arm in his and began to lead him back to the couch. "Oh, I don't need to say how delighted I am, do I, my dear lad? Oh, but why have you never told me of this British officer at Albuera?" "Because there was really nothing to tell. I kept a Polish lancer from spearing him, and that was all. I never even knew his name. And now it seems that, thanks to Miss Forrest's good offices, and Lord Falgrave's, of course, I've merely to show myself, to be sent back to France. It's astounding." It was not unnatural that he should go on in this vein for a little, and Hervey had no wish in the world to stop him. He was too rejoiced himself. Yet before long an unpleasant little thought was tapping like a woodpecker in his own brain. What is to become of me when my illegal share in this happy event is revealed? And no one, not even the boy himself, seems to be going to give a thought to that. But he was ashamed of this selfish reflection, and, lest he should betray any preoccupation with his own safety, abstained from reminding the fugitive for the second time that he ought not to show himself yet, merely announcing that, to his regret, he must hurry off to keep an appointment in Taunton. He should probably be back late. "So, remember Mr. Touchwood's orders, Rowl," he said as he left him. "Bed at 9 o'clock sharp. Have pleasant dreams to you tonight." Raoul did not feel sure about the night, but he had one here and now, an enchanting daydream, in which Juliana sat beside him still, and he was able to say all the things he had left unsaid, and in which he thought at first much less of the great news which she had brought him than of tomorrow, when she would come again, and he could gaze at her anew. But after a while he did think of it absorbedly. How could it really be that he was practically a free man, about to be sent back to France, after all his struggles and shifts, by the British government itself. He saw the news arriving at Les Sablières, and Maman reading his letter in her bedroom with the old-fashioned furniture, and running with it to his father in the library of the chateau, under the portrait of that forbidding-looking ancestor in the buff coat who had fought with Turenne. And then they would both tell Adrienne, and perhaps in the orchard, where she would be supervising the harvesting of those apple trees that he and she used so assiduously to climb. And then, a little later, there would be his mother in his arms, his father saying that he was not ashamed of him, and Adrienne hearing how he had impersonated her. And, to make this dream true, he had only to present himself at the transport office, to meet this grateful major of the 3rd Foot, and establish his identity. Raoul, lying with his hands behind his head, suddenly became so still that the robin which he had been trying to tame did alight for a moment on his foot, and cocked its head at him. But the young man never even saw that this signal favour had been accorded to him. A thought like a dark cloud had suddenly obscured the golden horizon. It was not so simple as all that. How could he go and present himself at the transport office and establish his identity without terribly injuring Hervey Barrington? A month ago he had been reported drowned by Captain Barrington himself. How was it that he had not been drowned, and where had he been all the time? He would not tell the authorities, of course, not even if they refused the cartel in consequence. Oh, but the danger was that they would find out. And if they did, they would find not only that Captain Barrington had concealed him for weeks, but that he had deliberately told a lie to cover his action, and told it in black and white in an official report. The discovery could hardly harm him, since even at the time he was destined for a pardon. But for Hervey Barrington it would mean utter ruin. And was he to go lightly off to France and leave him to that? Raoul suddenly became very nervous. Suppose someone were to look over the wall now and see him. And suppose some inquisitive stranger were to come into the garden. And to think that he had only been stopped by Captain Barrington from walking openly out to Lord Falgrave's carriage. He shivered, rang the bell at his elbow, and got off the couch. And when Mrs. Jeremy appeared in answer to this summons, demanded to enter the house on the plea that it was getting cold, on which he was led back and scolded for not having rung earlier. But the offer of a fire he refused, saying that he should soon go to bed, and so laboriously ascended the stairs to the morning-room. Once alone there, he took up a book, threw it down, sat in the window-seat, and looked at the estuary, the Kestrel, the opposite shore rosy with the sunset. Oh, this must be talked over. Oh, but with whom? Hervey would say, go and claim your freedom, and never mind about me. And Juliana Forrest, who had brought it to him, would hardly urge him to throw it away. Oh, what was he to do? For some 20 minutes he sat there thinking it over, till all at once he heard Jeremy's heavy foot pounding rapidly up the stairs, and the coxswain put his head in. "Oh, you're here, sir. He was out of breath. "Oh, come in," said Raoul from the window-seat. "Oh, what is it?" And then, seeing his alarmed discomposure, he got up. "Oh, not an accident to Captain Barrington, I hope." "No, sir," said Jeremy. "Worse." He came nearer and dropped his voice. "Mr. Rowl, they've heard." No need to ask what or who they were. "Oh, great God," said Raoul. "Are they after me? But I'm—" "Nay, not after you," interrupted Jeremy contemptuously. "After him, because of you. When I were out this afternoon," he went on, still breathlessly, "I fell in with one of the coast guards and stopped to pass the time of day. And after some talk, he says, Seems to me there my great interest took sudden in that French prisoner as was drowned here last month, says he. Why, whatever do we mean, says I, feeling like a man do when he see a squall coming sudden out of the northeast, and him carrying too much sail. Whatever do we mean, Jan? Why, says he then, only this afternoon there was a lady and gentleman from London asking about him, and we sends them on to Captain Barrington, as saw it happen, and blow me if now on top of that there ain't a Navy lieutenant asking the very same questions, only more of 'em, where the prisoner come from, just whereabouts he were drowned, whether it was thought there was any smugglers aiding and abetting of him, and so on. So I says to him, "You go and see Captain Barrington, sir. He'll tell you all there is to know." "Yes, I'm going to see Captain Barrington in any case," says he. "Well?" asked Raoul, who was oddly breathless, too, as Jeremy paused. "Arter that," resumed Jeremy, "I come back as fast as I can, and finds out from Hannah that no Navy lieutenant ain't arrived. But don't you go flattering yourself, Mr. Rowl. He's been here, right enough, 5 minutes ago." "And what happened?" asked Raoul, feeling slightly sick. "Oh, he asks for Captain Barrington. I says he'm away from Stowey, and won't be back till late." At that, he looks almost as if he meant to wait, but I weren't going to let him into the house. So he says, looking grim-like, that he'll come again in the morning, seeing as he must see Captain Barrington in person, nor he wouldn't leave no message. Had some kind of a paper in his hand, too, but he put it back in his pocket and goes off, looking, well, as an officer looks when it's a matter of the bosun's mate and the cat o' nine tails. He was probably some friend or acquaintance of Captain Barrington's, urged Raoul, though he did not believe it. Captain Barrington's coxswain snorted. "How precious few of them, as I don't know by sight, one way or the other. And, moreover, when I asks him if he'll leave his name, he says, 'No, it's not known to Captain Barrington.' No, sir. He'm come from the Admiralty to make enquiries, and perhaps to take the captain back to London. Take my word for it, they've heard something. Else why should he have gone asking all these questions of the coast guards? And now the captain's got to answer for it all." Raoul sat down again, turning whiter and whiter. "I've always said," went on this new Jeremy, now so fiercely loquacious, "and that he didn't ought to have done it. And him, as it were, under their lordships' displeasure already, and though he was acquitted at the court-martial. And quite right, too, for if ever—" His hearer was on his feet. "What in God's name are you talking about? What court-martial?" "We haven't never told you why he's on half-pay. On the shelf." "I didn't know he was on half-pay. I thought he was on leave. You gave me to understand so." "Leave? An officer like him? In wartime?" said Jeremy scornfully. "No, him eating his heart out these 2 years, and all along of the Suffolk lost off the Scillies through no fault of his, and if ever there'd been a chance of his getting another ship, as was always said he would, because he left the court without any sort of blame being put upon him. Well, it don't look much like it now, do it, harbouring a French prisoner and lying about it, as I always said he were crazed to do. And now, if it's been found out—" He made a short, dramatic pause, during which Raoul subsided once more onto the window-seat and put his head against the mullion, speechless. So this was the explanation of the sad sternness of Captain Barrington's face in repose. And, for his sake, he had weighted the scale against himself still further. "They always say as it's bad luck to save a man from drowning," resumed the sailor darkly. "He's sure to do you an injury in the end." Raoul got up, steadying himself by the sill. "Oh, Jeremy, that's Captain Barrington's sailing boat, isn't it? Eh bien, the moment it is dark, You can start for some place on the coast, anywhere, and just turn me out there. As long as I'm out of this house, and no one sees me go, nothing can be proved." There was a feverish flush on his cheek. "Oh, you'd not get far," said Jeremy, eyeing him dubiously. "Oh, that would not matter, so long as I was not here." Jeremy considered a moment. "No, not without Captain Barrington's orders. I couldn't do that." "Oh, but, you fool," said Raoul impatiently. "He would never give them. Oh, don't you know him better than that? This must be done unknown to him, before he returns." "But he'd soon see the Kestrel was gone," objected Jeremy, "and a sailing boat's easy tracked by other folk." "Then what are we to do?" asked Raoul. "You want to get rid of me at once, I suppose, and just as much or more than I want to go. But I cannot walk far. It is no good pretending it. I cannot hire a conveyance here. Couldn't you row me somewhere in the little boat?" "How, the skiff? I've got her bottom up in the garden for caulking of her seams, and she's leaking a bit. I couldn't go rowing no distance in her." "I'll get another boat, then, from somewhere." "I won't have to answer a mort of questions." "No, I'll see what can be done to the skiff between now and dark, and maybe I can get her shipshape enough to put you across the river, sir. And that would be better than nothing." Raoul put his hand to his head, which was beginning to ache. "Yes, and I must go after Captain Barrington's return, not before. Then he will not find out until morning. Oh, don't let Mrs. Jeremy know, either. What time, do you think?" Jeremy reflected deeply. "There's no moon to speak of. Sun rises about 5:30. I'll have to slip out without waking Hannah, for she'd certain sure stop me. I should say as near 3:00 as possible, sir." "Very well. And try and bring me some food to take with me. I will save what I can for my supper. I must have a map of some kind, too. Do you know where Captain Barrington keeps his?" But Jeremy did not know. "And where would you be thinking of making for, sir?" "Upon my soul, I don't know," answered Raoul, and laughed. When Jeremy was gone, he hunted vainly in the bookcase and drawers for a map, and then fell to writing a note for Hervey, for there was no point in leaving him in the dark as to why he was running away. He wrote it stumblingly. It sounded to him cold and dry, compared with what he felt towards him, and the message he asked Hervey to convey to Miss Forrest, more inadequate still. He supposed he should leave this note on his pincushion, like a heroine of romance. Acutely depressed, he went upstairs, undressed, and got into bed. He must not excite Mrs. Jeremy's suspicions. It was the last time she would bring him a meal, the last time he should have her comfortable presence beside him. And apparently he was not to enjoy even that bittersweet consolation, for it was his fellow conspirator who brought him his supper. "Oh, I got Hannah to let me do it," he whispered, so absorbed by intrigue that the bowl of soup nearly slid off the tray onto its destined recipient. "Now, if you'll be ready, sir, from 2:00 onwards, I'll come so soon as I can give Hannah the slip. I've been overhauling the skiff." The door opened. "What are you worrying Mr. Rowl about that boat for?" asked the voice of his spouse as she came in after all. "Oh, he isn't interested in that. Now, Mr. Rowl, you eat up your soup, or you won't be looking your best if the beautiful young lady comes to see you again tomorrow. You stayed up too long, as it was. What are you waiting for, Jeremy?" Rolling a conspiratorial eye towards the bed, John Jeremy reluctantly departed. Oh, yes, it would be funny, if it were not otherwise. Rowl obediently consumed his soup, but his eyes followed Mrs. Jeremy as she went and pulled to the window curtains. "Oh, I shan't bring your breakfast till a bit later tomorrow," she announced. "No good comes of invalids being waked too early." Behind her back, the invalid smiled a pale smile. Presently she came and stood by him. "Oh, well, my dear, and a beautiful young lady she is indeed. Oh, what's that under your pillow? A bread?" I thought I might be hungry in the night," muttered Raoul shamefacedly. "Oh, my dear life, don't put it there. You'll have nasty crumbs all down the bed." She rescued the slice. "I'll leave it on the table, covered over. Oh, but don't let me hear of your being awake in the night to eat it." "Oh, no, very well, you shall not hear of it," promised her charge, on which she tucked him in, saying, "Now go to sleep, for I wouldn't keep awake for the captain if I was you, and dream of your visitors." "Mrs. Jeremy," said Raoul, "will you kiss me?" "Oh, well, I never!" exclaimed Mrs. Jeremy. Then she saw that he was not joking, or near it. "Oh, what's the matter with you this evening?" "Well, there, my dear," she added quite simply. "Oh, to tell truth, I've often thought of doing it, and I dare say the beautiful young lady wouldn't mind." After the salute and her departure, Raoul did blow out the candle and try to go to sleep while he could, but kaleidoscopic visions of past and future kept forming and reforming in his brain, till at last one dominated the rest and stayed. Juliana Forrest coming to this house tomorrow, full of her generous plans, to find him fled in the night with scarcely a word, and the safety she had brought him after such long endeavours flung away. Would she understand that he must do it? Oh, surely, her past conduct showed it. Yet, after all, she was a woman, and it would seem an affront to her to find him gone. And gone whither? And to claim his freedom in such haste that he could not wait to see her again. No, it was intolerable that she should think that, when, as far as he could see, he never would be able to claim it because of Captain Barrington. When, indeed, if he were recaptured in the next few days, and the chances of that were about 10 to 1, he would certainly be taken back to the hulks. But he must explain this more fully than in his message. He must write a letter to Juliana also. He relit the candle, found writing materials, began, and then paused miserably. Which would be worse for her to hear, that he, throwing away the pardon she had so miraculously won for him, was going to allow himself, most probably, to be taken back to the inferno from which she had rescued him, or that he was going to attempt to leave England without ever seeing her again. Sitting up in his bed, the harassed young man groaned and ran his hand through his hair. His conduct would surely appear to her unpardonable. Nevertheless, though distracted, he did not waver. He had no choice but to act thus, and slay his hopes. Hopes of what? He had none. It was only that he would give 10 years of his life to see her again. At any rate, the most sensible thing was to explain clearly what he was about to do, and why, and ask her to try to forgive him. He set to work, and gradually the pencil ran on hotfoot. When he saw how much he had written, he was astonished, and without reading it over, he thrust it under his pillow, blew out the candle, and, lying hastily down, closed his eyes, for he had heard Hervey's step on the stair, and could not trust himself to speak to him. The door opened softly, and Captain Barrington, shading a candle with his hand, came in, while Raoul lay motionless, watching him under his lashes. He crept on tiptoe to the bed, as careful as one who fears to wake a child, stood over him a moment studying him, and then he and the candle vanished toward the historic cupboard. In another moment he came back with something white hanging over his arm, put the candle down, and proceeded to arrange this white object over Raoul's feet. Apparently it was the coverlet of Miss Lavinia's bed. Raoul's heart went out to him in an almost painful impulse. No, decidedly he could not speak to him. If only he had it in his power to make him more than the negative return for all his goodness, which he was about to make. At least he would make that willingly. He did, even though the cost was so heavy in regret and relinquishment. Oh, but what is it to relinquish a dream? Less than a dream. Harvey Barrington had risked for him something much more solid than that. Oh, goodbye, my dear Barrington, he said within himself. God bless you, and give you your heart's desire. End of section 27. Section 28 of Mr. Rowl by D.K. Broster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ialin. Part 4, Chapter 4. What Miss Lavinia brought home. Quote, Since, then, not suspicion but fondness has detected you, let me not lose the advantage of my discovery. End quote. Rasselas, Chapter 14. If you feel, and feel rightly, that part of the glamour of mushrooms is the finding of them, then in any district where their habitat is known to others, you must get up early to secure this enjoyment and them. And that is why Miss Lavinia Barrington, who adored both, left her little house, armed with a basket, at 6:15 on this fine but misty September morning, and betook herself to the high, dew-drenched meadows on the banks of the river. A couple of miles or so downstream, on the farther side, the port of Stowey still showed half asleep, though a few unwavering columns of smoke were beginning to testify to certain household activities. In the next field, which had just been ploughed, gulls were walking along the furrows among the rooks, but these winged creatures, as intent upon their breakfast as Miss Lavinia upon hers, were the only signs of life. Nobody else, to her satisfaction, was out after mushrooms this morning. Or was there someone? The meadow which she had selected was rather like a green sheet pinned out insecurely between its fringe of copse at either end, and sagging into a hollow in the middle. And in the nearer copse, which was also that nearer to Stowey, Miss Barrington distinctly heard sticks crack underfoot. She glanced towards it, and the crackling instantly stopped. Oh, probably a poacher, which she did not mind, because he would have ambitions above mushrooms. But some 10 minutes later, when Miss Lavinia, who worked methodically, was harvesting at the other side of the field, though on the same slope, she saw a man come out of the copse at the point where she had already heard the sticks snap, and begin to descend the field, keeping close to the hedge which ran between it and its ploughed neighbour. If he was a poacher, thought Miss Barrington, looking at him idly across the width of the meadow, he was remarkably well dressed, for one, and he had no gun. No, he was no poacher. He was a gentleman, a young man, too, and his walk almost suggested that he was drunk, which was possible, though unlikely so early in the morning. With this peculiar gait he proceeded down the slope, but when he was faced with the uphill gradient, it was evidently too much for his legs. He stopped, lurched, and, catching sight of a stile in the hedge, went and sat down hastily on the lower step, leaning his head forward in his hands. On this Miss Barrington, deciding that he was not drunk but indisposed, charitably started across the field to him. But before she got very near, he evidently heard her coming, and, leaving the stile, started as hard as he could up the slope in front of him. "Oh, stop!" cried Miss Barrington. "Stop! I want to help you." But despite his obvious difficulty in walking, her quarry pushed on up the rise as though a fury were after him, and making his way through its sparse hedge, and disappeared in the thicket at the top. Miss Barrington had, however, gained on him so much that she was in this refuge the moment after, and there he was, leaning against a young sycamore, his back to her, gasping. "Are you ill, young man?" asked Miss Lavinia, approaching him. "Oh, let me." He half turned, as though to ward her off, and she saw who it was. Oh, heavens above! Mr. Rowl! Mr. Rowl stared at her without speech. "Oh, for God's sake, sit down," said Miss Lavinia hastily. She looked to see him pitch forward at her feet. His face was so ashy. "Oh, there, that's better." For, almost sliding down the trunk, he had let himself subside and sat down on the dead leaves below, half supported by one hand. I am," he said, opening and shutting his eyes several times in succession. "I'm trying." His head drooped. "Yes, never mind," said Miss Lavinia, wishing that she carried smelling salts. "You're running away, I know, but you need not have run from me. Just sit there a little." Very tactfully she supplemented the half-support of the tree with an arm, so insensibly indeed that she flattered herself he did not know it, and at the same time she laid a speculative finger on the furiously bounding pulse in the nearest wrist. "Oh, we must go on, Sir Louis," murmured the collapsed fugitive. "Oh, I beg your pardon." He had raised his head, and was now looking at his companion with startled eyes. "Oh, how did I—" "Oh, you came on your legs," said Miss Barrington, withdrawing her arm. "Most unwisely, I should say. However, here you are. You grew tired of Fairhaven, perhaps." Raoul shifted himself to get his shoulders fairly against the tree. He had discarded his sling, but was evidently chary of using his left arm. "I was afraid that Captain Barrington was in danger because of my presence, so I left." "Admirably succinct," commented Miss Barrington, sitting back on her heels, and even in that position retaining all her dignity. "And may I ask where you are going?" Raoul dropped his head. "Oh, I don't very well know," he admitted, fingering the leaves on one side of him. "I could not procure a map, and I find that I cannot walk far." "How you surprise me," remarked Miss Lavinia. "At any rate, you're now coming home to my cottage to help me eat these mushrooms. The distance is not great." "Oh, no, I could not do that," said Raoul quickly. "I assure you I am not entirely unprotected," observed Miss Lavinia with great gravity. "I have a maid and a gardener." But Raoul looked at her without a smile. "And I have not been hiding you," she went on, "if that is what is troubling you. Are you not hungry?" "Yes," avowed the young man, and his glance fell on the basket. "You would let me go on afterwards?" "You talk as if I'd captured you." "Oh, but I think you have," said the runaway, and his mouth did twitch a little. "I must say that it is not easy to get away from your family, Miss Barrington." "Oh, come, that's more like yourself, and that is captors." "Yes," she said, aloud. "I expect you will soon have my brother on your track." Raoul shook his head. "Oh, he does not know." "Oh, perhaps," he pursued, beginning to struggle to his feet. "The explanation is that I'm not very good at escaping." "Yet, one way and the other," said Miss Lavinia, assisting him. "You've certainly had enough practice. I think that for the peace of this country it is time you had your exchange." "But I believe that I've got it," returned the young man casually. "I heard yesterday. A pardon, in fact, but I cannot claim it." "And why not, pray?" "Because the authorities would be almost sure to find out where I'd been these last weeks. I would sooner go back to the hulks than bring disaster on Captain Barrington. As it is, I'm afraid the Admiralty has got wind of something. A naval officer came demanding him yesterday when he was out, and is coming again this morning, so I got Jeremy to put me across the river before it was light, and I must get farther away. I must, Miss Barrington, and perhaps I could hire a horse." "Yes, yes," said the lady. "We will see about all that after breakfast, and you shall tell me more about this officer. For you can't trust me to be alive to my brother's danger, can't you?" "Yes," said Raoul, looking at her in a rather bewildered way. But for the rest of your life you will distrust women, you mean?" "No, no," said Raoul hastily, and no doubt it was to prove his confidence in the sex, as well as because the ground seemed so unstable, that he took her arm with no more than a half-hearted protest, and they moved together out of the little wood. Susan, Miss Barrington's maid, was a good deal surprised when she was told that there would be a young gentleman to breakfast, but, as she never thought of questioning her mistress's orders, it was with only a mild wonder why a visitor should arrive so early that she cooked the mushrooms. And when she had her first sight of him, lying back, very pale, in Miss Barrington's own easy-chair, she decided that the young gentleman had arrived by sea and had not yet recovered from that devastating experience. Raoul was indeed so much at the end of his tether by the time he arrived at Woodbine Cottage that his hostess forbade him to utter a word until he had eaten and drunk. Not till then did she ask how he had heard of his pardon. "Lord Falgrave has been good enough to interest himself in my case," said her visitor with a slight increase of colour. "He came to Fairhaven yesterday, and—" "Who?" asked Miss Barrington. "Lord Falgrave. Frederick Forrest." Yes, I suppose his name is Forrest," answered Raoul. "Oh, you know him, Miss Barrington?" "Oh, I knew him," said Miss Barrington, smiling at memories of her own. "Oh, poor Frederick. She was said to have broken his heart." "Yes, I knew him, 100 years ago. And so he came down to Devonshire to call on you?" "Oh, not exactly," replied the young Frenchman. "I think it was rather to erect a tombstone to me. They thought I was drowned, you see." "Who is they?" asked Miss Lavinia like a shot. "I thought Lady Falgrave was dead these 20 years. "Lord Falgrave was accompanied by his daughter," explained Raoul, striving to give this announcement an air of small importance. "Oh, indeed," said Miss Barrington. "May I repeat your question? Do you know her?" The colour in the face of her vis-à-vis was sufficient answer. It is she who... You mean that you're betrothed?" Raoul nearly leapt from his seat. "Miss Barrington, what are you saying? I mean that she has done for me... No, there are no words to say all that she has done. Contrived my escape from the hulks, and poured out money on my behalf, and now has got me a cartel." "Well, my dear Mr. Rowl," said Miss Lavinia, "and then I think there only remains one thing for her to do to complete her good work, and that is to marry you." Instead of colouring, this time, the young man on the other side of the breakfast table turned rather white. "I know that you're only jesting, Miss Barrington, but out of regard for Miss Forrest, I would ask you—" Yes, yes," interrupted his hostess. "I've a vulgar wit, my dear Mr. Rowl. My brother implied the same on the night of your first arrival. But I can appreciate your delicacy. We will not consider, then, the procurer of the cartel, only the fact. May I ask what it is for?" Raoul briefly told her. "But, as I say, I cannot claim it." "How did you say that to Miss Forrest? It would be encouraging news for her, after all her efforts." No doubt Miss Barrington told herself that she was being cruel only to be kind, for she must have known from Raoul's face that she was being cruel. "Oh, I did not think of it at the moment," he said. He was pricking the tablecloth with a fork. "But I cannot bring ruin on Captain Barrington, even—" He stopped, and the prongs of the fork ran right through the damask. "Oh, my dear boy," said Miss Lavinia warmly, "you must pardon the term, for you might well be my son, you know. I assure you that I appreciate your self-sacrifice on my brother's behalf. but I think so much abnegation is not, perhaps, necessary. Oh, listen. I suggest that you present yourself at the transport office, either not saying a word of where you have been since your supposed drowning, or making up a story of having been, let us say, cast up at some lonely spot on the coast and cared for there by some unnamed poor people whom it is not worth the government's while to prosecute. And besides, it is no crime to care for a half-drowned man, and they in no way helped you to escape from the country. As soon as you were well enough to do so, you left them. You don't look so robust. With that bandaged wrist, too. That doubt can be cast on that statement. How is the transport office going to disprove any part of that story? Raoul, with an elbow on the table, had been listening attentively. I should also have to account for the manner in which I first heard of my good fortune. Yes, perhaps. But it depends a great deal on what errand this officer has come to Fairhaven. Well, that I can soon find out, returned Miss Barrington, getting up. I will drive over to Stowey at once and see, if you will give me your word to remain here. Parole d'honneur, Monsieur le Capitaine. Or else the coal cellar. A brief smile flickered over her prisoner's face. You leave me no choice, Miss Barrington. I give you my parole until you return. Yes, he added meditatively. I could always refuse to accept the cartel, unless they promised not to make investigations about my whereabouts. Oh, I am glad, said Miss Barrington, to see that you're open to reason. Our first step is certainly to find out about this messenger of doom from the Admiralty. I will order my pony cart. Incidentally, my brother will be glad to hear where you are, I fancy. You say you made John Jeremy put you across the river. I'm sorry for him. Oh, Jeremy is a faithful soul, said Raoul. All along he has thought of his master's interests, not of mine, and quite rightly, too. Yes, but you may be sure that his master won't hold that an excuse. There seem to be a good many martyrdoms over this affair of yours, Mr. Rowl. Raoul sighed and studied the carpet. He was much depressed. Miss Lavinia looked at him keenly and added, Nor are martyrs always of the male sex, you know. He looked up, startled. Oh, Miss Barrington, but you know that it is not my wish to stay here and perhaps involve you, too. Give me back my parole. Oh, never in life, said his hostess, tugging at the bell-pull. You're too slippery. But you did not really think I was referring to myself, did you? Susan, tell Jacob to harness the pony at once. Now, come back to this comfortable chair, Mr. Rowl. By the way, have you the address of this major who owes you his life and must needs identify you? He's quartered, I believe, at Canterbury. You will have to communicate with him. Yes, I suppose so. Unless Lord Falgrave does so. I cannot expect Lord Falgrave to take any further trouble when I've behaved in what must seem to him such an extraordinary way. No, perhaps you can't, said Miss Lavinia uncompromisingly. She studied him again as he stood before her, and between her liking for him and her feeling that she owed him some reparation for the past, resolved to take a hand in his destiny to better purpose than last time. For all that, she went on to point out that, since he could find Major Brackenbury, he was in a position to carry through the business of the cartel without Lord Falgrave's assistance at all. But this truth seemed very little to exhilarate her visitor. Biting his lip, he merely looked broodingly at her. Well, I'm going to put on my bonnet and set off, said Miss Barrington. I propose that you sit quietly in this chair with a book till I return. Now, remember that I have your word of honour that you will not give me the slip. Oh, you don't think, surely, Miss Barrington, said poor Raoul in a tone of anguish, that I wanted to give anybody the slip. Oh, except your friends in the Ganges. No, I don't. but you have an uncontrollably quixotic turn of mind, I'm afraid." She patted his arm, as if, however, this quality did not displease her, put cushions in the chair, a book in his hand, and departed. And Raoul sat in her chair, leaning his head against the back, frankly wretched. Once again he had made a mess of his affairs, a supreme mess. But once again he did not see how he could have done differently. Yet, if only he could see Juliana for 5 minutes to explain. A letter was so doubtful an ambassador. But it seemed to him that she would never listen to an explanation after such an affront. He knew, none better, of what she was capable with regard to a man who had displeased her. But if he did see her for 5 minutes, if she did listen, yes, even if the arrangement shadowed forth yesterday in the Garden of Eden were carried out, and he went up to London with her and her father to claim the cartel, what would be the result? Only more heartache for him. No, the sooner he got out of England, the better. For other reasons than because of a distaste for captivity. Over there, he could throw himself body and soul into the following of his emperor's paling star. And for how it had paled in the last 12 months. For a time, he sat staring moodily into the empty hearth, and absent-mindedly stroking the black kitten, which had come in with Susan when she cleared the breakfast table, and which had established itself on his knee. Then they both fell asleep. And being pretty well exhausted, and having had practically no sleep the night before, Raoul, for his part, slept the minute hand twice round Miss Lavinia's ormolu clock, though, if he had known the full extent of Miss Lavinia's activities meanwhile, it is probable that his slumber would have been less profound. The door opening smartly woke him with a jump. "Raoul, are you there?" It was Hervey Barrington's voice. "A miserable lad! What a morning I've spent! How dared you do such a thing?" He was over him, shaking him, and the kitten, frightened and indignant, sprang from Raoul's knee to his father's shoulder. "You've seen Miss Barrington, I suppose?" inquired the culprit, looking up at him rather shamefacedly. "I meant to get much farther than this. May—" He gave a shrug, and the kitten promptly scratched his cheek. "But for God's sake, tell me what the officer from the Admiralty wanted, if you know by this time." Captain Barrington, apparently in a most unusual state of excitement, took a turn down the room, flung his riding whip with a clatter onto the table, and said, "How I do know! And never, never, as I am a living man, did a messenger bring news more ironical." He laughed. Raoul was rather alarmed, and twisted in the chair to look at him. "Oh, tell me quickly. Oh, Barrington, if I've harmed you—" "Harmed me? You've given me the wish of my heart," said Hervey, and at that Raoul almost began to fear for his sanity. "Oh, listen," said Captain Barrington more calmly, "and don't look so apprehensive. That naval officer, yesterday, who so terrified the timid Jeremy. And, by the way," he added rather grimly, "I think Jeremy is timid with more reason this morning. Merely came to deliver to me a letter of introduction from a friend of mine in London. The letter, however, happens to contain some news as well. Would you like to see it?" And without waiting for a reply, he threw a missive onto Raoul's knee. Raoul unfolded it and read, "My dear Barrington, this is to make known to you Lieutenant Fanshawe, late of the Sappho frigate, a promising young officer, whom, as he has occasion to spend a few days in Stowey on private matters, I desire to introduce to your notice. He is, in some sort, a cousin of my wife's, so we shall be grateful to you on his behalf for the light of your countenance." Raoul gave an exclamation. "Then the visit of that lieutenant yesterday was quite harmless, He only wished to present this letter of introduction. Oh, that was all. The rest was Jeremy's guilty imagination. You fled from a shadow, you see, you scoundrel. But why then did he question the Coast Guard about my drowning? Oh, from curiosity or zeal, I suppose. He said nothing about it to me this morning. But go on. And now, my dear fellow, I seize this opportunity of giving you a piece of good news. You may take it from me, or, better still, from Charles Denison of the Admiralty, who told me yesterday that the sun of official approval is about to shine on you once more from behind that damnable black cloud which ought never to have obscured it, and that when the new first-rate Thetis, 90 guns, is commissioned, she's all but ready, as you probably know, her captain will be one George Hervey Barrington. Raoul sprang up, his face alight. Oh, Hervey! He was unconscious that he had used his Christian name. Oh, is it true? Oh, I suppose so, said Hervey, half sitting on the table like a boy. Oh, but go on. The cream is yet to come. Read why I'm thus to be reinstated. Raoul obeyed. You will naturally wish to know why their lordships have at last realized what they were throwing away by not employing you. It appears that, although your friends believed them to have your case continually under their benign consideration, they had really forgotten all about you. But you may remember, about a month ago, sending to the commander of one of the Plymouth hulks a report on the drowning of an escaped French prisoner at Stowey. This report was forwarded in due course to the Transport Office, and came up in its turn at a meeting of the board. As chance and your good star would have it, my dear Barrington, that meeting happened, I don't quite know why, to be attended by Admiral Clutterbuck of the Navy Board. When it came to your name in connection with this document, it appears that he nearly lifted the roof off. What, is that fellow still kicking his heels in Devonshire, reporting on escaped prisoners, when he ought to be making them? Oh, by blank, I never heard of such a scandal, etc., etc., all the more vigorously, no doubt, that he was partly responsible for the scandal himself. The upshot of it was, I believe, a stiff breeze at the Admiralty, terminating in their lordships' resolution to appoint you to the Thetis, a piece of news, obligingly communicated to me, as I say, by Charles Denison, who knew of what interest and pleasure it would be to me. Nota bene. If I did not know C.D. to be an absolutely trustworthy informant, I should not be so cruel as to pass on the statement. As it is, I've no hesitation in offering you, my dear Barrington, my warmest congratulations. A little antedated, perhaps, but not much. Indeed, I fancy you had better be looking over your kit. Raoul dropped the letter and seized Hervey's hands. Oh, Hervey, he said again, with tears in his eyes. Oh, my dear friend, let me congratulate you too. Why, said Hervey, smiling, and not unresponsive to the grip. Oh, it is I who ought to thank you for bringing this about. If I had not sent in that lying report, it would never have happened. A strange reward for something like felony, isn't it? I did a better day's work for myself than I thought when I hauled you into the Kestrel in spite of your efforts. But you'll admit that it is a little ironical. Oh, I'm so delighted that I won't admit anything, cried Raoul. Between this and the kind intentions of the Transport Board towards me, all my thoughts of your Admiralty are rosy just now. I would decree them all halos, des auréoles bien dorées. 90 guns, and new. With so large a vessel, Barrington, you will surely have to be made an admiral. Oh, it is a pity that she will not be allowed to take you over to Morlaix. It would only be fitting. Raoul thrust a hand into his pocket and turned a little away. Oh, I'm not so sure that I am going to Morlaix, he observed nonchalantly. Hervey caught him by the shoulder and spun him round again. Oh, Raoul, Raoul, you've done enough in that line. And to think that I wondered, yesterday, if any thought of my position would ever strike you. Oh, I could have kicked myself for it this morning, when Mrs. Jeremy brought me your letter. Now, if you hesitate to claim your freedom because of any scruples about me, He paused, as if selecting a thread. "What will you do?" asked Raoul with levity. "Oh, you can't make me, if I don't choose. I am my own master, and parbleu. Oh, I can take the matter out of your hands by going up to the transport office and telling them everything. How I lied about you and hid you. Oh, how would you like that, you crazy young runaway? But my sister has been talking the matter over with me this morning, as I understand she has already done with you, and I think, as she does, that if you do not object to telling the commissioners a few lies, the matter can be put through without involving me at all. You see, by successfully removing yourself from Fairhaven, you have already severed the link between us to a certain degree. But perhaps, since you abandoned female attire, you've sworn a vow never to tell anything but the strict truth." Raoul made a face at him. "If I tell any more lies, they shall be the lies of Miss Barrington, who is a lady of great resource. I will trust her, perhaps, with my conscience. Oh, tiens, I think I hear the wheels of her chariot returning." Hervey listened a moment. The window was open. "Yes, I hear them too." "Raoul," he said, with a change of voice, "I have scolded you for this escapade, though not nearly as much as you deserve. But I've not told you what I think of you for sacrificing yourself for my sake." "But," said Raoul, with a little shrug, "there is no need. As it fell out, voyez-vous, it was silly of me to run away. And all that I sacrificed was a night's rest." "Was that really all?" asked Hervey. Raoul either could not or would not meet his eyes. He avoided them by the expedient of dropping suddenly down into his former chair. "Oh, ma foi, was not that enough?" he asked perversely. "A whole good night's sleep. And that was why you found me asleep just now. Like the little cat, who had perhaps lost hers, too. Oh, where is she, then?" He stooped from the chair to search for the kitten, Hervey standing and looking at him, wondering if his half-suspicion of a far greater sacrifice made for him were correct. From Miss Forrest's demeanour, indeed, when he had conveyed the letter left for her and the news to the Dolphin this morning, he had been able to deduce nothing. Suddenly Miss Lavinia's head appeared at the window. "Oh, Hervey, come and take the pony round to the stables for me, and there's a good soul," she said. "I don't know where Jacob has got to. No, not you, Mr. Rowl. You stay where you are, please." Obediently Hervey went to the window and put one leg over the sill and vanished. Raoul scrambled out of the chair again, took up the letter of good news from the table, and began to reread it. But he had not got through the first paragraph before he was aware of the door opening. The voice of Susan thereupon murmured, "Miss Barrington said in here, if you please, miss." And someone came in. A lady. End of section 28. Section 29 of Mr. Rowl by D.K. Broster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ialin. Part 4, Chapter 5. The Marriage of Dunois. Quote, "The union of these two affections," said Rasselas, "would produce all that could be wished. Perhaps there is a time when marriage might unite them, a time neither too early for the father nor too late for the husband." End quote. Rasselas, Chapter 29. "Oh," she exclaimed, as the door shut. "Oh, I thought no one—" Raoul, as still as she had suddenly become, stood perfectly mute for a moment, Hervey Barrington's correspondence clutched in a tightening hand. Was he really going to have that 5 minutes, after all? and then the room began to swing warningly round him. Horrified at this tendency, he retreated a step or two, till he could brace himself against the high back of the chair he had just quitted. "Oh, will you not sit down, mademoiselle?" he stammered out. Oh, she was lovelier than ever, as always when she flushed. He remembered it from Wanfield days. To his infatuated eyes the very clothes she wore seemed cloth of gold, and though it was not at them that he was gazing. Juliana likewise continued to look across the room at him. "Oh, I think it is you who should sit down, Monsieur de Sablières," she said gently, on which, with a final effort to show that he was not such a poor thing after all, Monsieur de Sablières moved towards her, and speech was restored to him. "Oh, did you receive my letter? Did you understand? Oh, did you, mademoiselle? I had to do it. It seems it was a mistake, and Captain Barrington was not in immediate danger. But I thought he was." "Yes," said Juliana, with the same gentleness. "Oh, I perfectly understood. Captain Barrington brought me your letter this morning. I honoured you for feeling so, and for acting as you did, and to your own disadvantage." The relief was so intense, her praise so intoxicating, that Raoul's heart seemed to stop for a moment, and he was therefore guilty, for the first time in his life, of sitting down while a lady stood, for he drifted rather quickly to the window-seat and sank upon it. "Ah, that is right," murmured Miss Forrest, and, possibly with an idea of keeping him safely there, she also came and seated herself at the other corner. "You do really pardon my seeming discourtesy and ingratitude?" once more inquired the runaway anxiously, leaning a little towards her. The fresh air steadied him, but her proximity did not. "Oh, I saw neither to pardon," Juliana assured him gravely. "But what I do find difficult to forgive, Monsieur de Sablières, is the small consideration you have displayed for your own state of health. For that I do think you should be blamed. And how did you, scarcely convalescent, contrive to get as far as this?" "But I did not get so far," retorted Raoul. "Miss Barrington captured me in a little wood and brought me here. Oh, I was not making for this house." You were surprised to find me here, I think," he ventured. "Oh, indeed. I'd no idea at all that I should see you," replied Miss Forrest rather hastily. "I must explain to you how I come to be here myself. Well, the fact is that Miss Barrington is an old friend of my father's, and though it had not occurred to him that Captain Barrington could be her brother, for in those days, I gather, he did not know that she had one, and that brother being so much younger. Well, Miss Barrington came to call upon my father this morning at the inn at Stowey, and in the end was so kind as to carry me off to dine with her." "Without mentioning that I was here," supplemented Raoul, in something that was between a question and a statement. "Oh, I wonder—" And there he stopped, suddenly realizing that a silence on Miss Barrington's part, otherwise so inexplicable, could only be due to strategy, and a strategy directed— Yes, to what end? The same conviction had evidently dawned on Miss Forrest also. She became very still for a moment, and then remarked in a detached tone, "What extremely fine asters those are." "I'd not observed them," said Raoul, following the direction of her eyes. The flowers in question, he then saw, were in a bowl on the table in the centre of the room, but he was quite able to admire them from the window-seat, where Miss Forrest and he were sitting, and he was sorry that she should feel it necessary to rise, go to the bowl, and bend over them, as if to smell them. Even he was aware that asters had no scent. Yet he understood her need of a diversion, and followed her to the table but slowly. "My father was unable to accompany me here to-day, as he is confined to his room with gout," volunteered Miss Forrest, with her back to him, taking an aster from the bowl. "Oh, I am extremely sorry to hear that," returned Raoul. "I feel that I am the unworthy cause of it." Oh, it is not a serious attack." Here she put back the aster with care, turned and faced him, and said, and somewhat to his surprise, "Oh, this matter of your cartel, Monsieur de Sablières, since we have met, we might as well discuss it. You explained, in your letter, why you felt you could not claim it. Oh, but surely we could think of some plan which would enable you to do so without involving Captain Barrington." It leapt to Raoul's mind that Miss Barrington's scheme had probably been expounded to her in the pony chaise, which made that astute lady's silence as to his whereabouts still more remarkable. No wonder, then, that Miss Forrest did not wish to refer explicitly to the author of the plan. She went on, "If we can do so satisfactorily, I still think that when my father is better, you might accompany us to London, as I proposed yesterday. One cannot, of course, tell how long his attack may last." As she spoke, Raoul was aware of a strange, rending vision of the truth about that journey to London. Yesterday, the prospect of accompanying her thither had seemed like heaven. Oh, delusion! It would not be heaven at all. It would be the fate of Tantalus. He must not let himself be beguiled into submitting to it. He looked down and beheld the kitten running perseveringly after its own tail. "If you will excuse me, mademoiselle, I think that that I'd better go separately." "Oh, but why?" Evidently much surprised, Juliana faced him across the table and the flowers. "Why, Monsieur de Sablières? I thought that, travelling with my father, you would, in a sense, be protected from inquiry until your freedom was established. That was why I proposed it, and my father also thinks well of the plan." Raoul looked up for a moment from the gyrations of the kitten. "You're all kindness, mademoiselle. If I had 100 lives, I could never repay what you have done for me." "Then why have you changed your mind? Yesterday you approved of the plan, I thought." And to that he said nothing. "Oh, it must be, I suppose," said Juliana slowly, and in an altered voice, "that you do not wish to have my society for a couple of days. And then evidently your forgiveness of the injury I've done you is not so complete as you pretend." Oh, how could she be so unseeing, and so cruel? "Oh, Juliana," said Raoul under his breath, and with that, throwing away discretion, went on desperately. "No, I cannot let you think that. If you press me so, I must tell you the reason, though it would be more honourable to keep silence. There's only one journey in the world that I want to take with you, and since I can never take it, I will travel alone now. Indeed, I would rather say farewell to you here, today, because I've less fortitude than I thought. And now that I've said this, you will wish it too. But I hope you will forgive me, because you forced me to tell you the truth." She was, he knew, standing rigid on the other side of the table. He knew it, though he was not looking at her. It broke his heart to end like this, and directly the words had burst out of him, he would have given almost anything to recall them. But the best that he could hope for now was that she would be merciful, and let him go without withering him for his presumption and folly. He looked at her to see. But Juliana, too, was standing with downcast eyes, and she was very pale, and twisting her fingers not at all like a goddess about to launch thunderbolts. I did not know you felt thus," she murmured, almost inaudibly. I'm very—" Seeing her so clement, Raoul took courage. "Oh, do not say that you're sorry for me, for I am not, except for my own weakness in telling you. Only say that you forgive me." "I was not going to say that I was sorry," replied Juliana. She was now nervously stripping off her gloves. "Only that I was very much surprised." And immediately she sat down on the chair by the table, put her elbows on the latter, and covered her face with her hands. By this manoeuvre, Raoul found himself extremely disconcerted, for it left him no prospect of her features by which to gauge her sentiments. Yet, perhaps, after all, they were going to be able to part good friends. He began to have at least a hope of it. And with the hope came also to him the weak-minded idea of allowing himself a partial reprieve. Might it not be almost necessary to call on her father in London, even if he journeyed thither separately? Oh, certainly, it would be more courteous. He was weighing the manner in which he should make this retrograde suggestion, when, from behind the shelter of her hands, Juliana Forrest uttered these amazing words. "Oh, what did you mean about the journey you wish to take with me?" "Oh, did you not really understand? Most beautiful," asked Raoul some 20 minutes later, when they sat side by side on Miss Lavinia's sofa. He still held her hand in both his own. Juliana turned her head away, and her reply was evasive and incoherent. "You see, I was so astonished," she murmured. "I never thought that you... And then you were so modest, and so I had to be horribly bold." "But I shall be called impudent," said Raoul, half to himself. "Your father..." Juliana looked round. "I do not pretend that I can bring Papa to reason all at once. It will take a little time, and we shall have to be patient." Laughter and remembrance came into her eyes. "Oh, I fear he will not say, 'De ma fille Isabelle, sous l'époux à l'instant.'" But in the end... Raoul loosed the hand. "Oh, he will call me an adventurer, a fortune hunter. Oh, I suppose that, unfortunately, you possess a fortune. Oh, have I been guilty of a calem, of a pun? Oh, a fortune. I have, and I have not. My money is not settled upon me. Papa can cut me off with a shilling, if he likes." "Oh, à la bonne heure," said her suitor with a sigh of relief. "Perhaps, however, he will leave you a guinea. Oh, at any rate, he cannot so easily call me those names. Oh, but there's another embarrassment. You perhaps succeed him." "No." "Why do you laugh, ma toute belle? I know that it does so happen sometimes, even in this ungallant country." "Not half so ungallant a country as yours has always been, sir," retorted Juliana. "We have no Salic law against queens in England. No, as it happens, the title goes to my uncle, and since I had the bad luck not to be born a boy. How is that a disappointment? If you thought that you were going to marry a peeress in her own right." "Ah, the bad luck not to be born a boy!" exclaimed Raoul in tones of horror. "Oh, grand Dieu, suppose you had been. What a terrible thought! As for the other question, I must own that I have a prejudice in favour of a wife who bears her husband's name. Now, ask me how a poor cavalry soldier is going to support a wife at all, and particularly one to whom he owes the price of a sapphire necklace. How did you not say sapphires?" "Oh, how are you going to support a wife, Mr. Rowl?" asked Juliana obediently. "Oh, in the first place," replied Mr. Rowl airily, "by my sword. But secondly, on the money that my rich uncle in Orleans will leave me at his death, which will shortly occur, I think. Money which I have sometimes intended to refuse, because he is personally odious to me, but which I shall now make the sacrifice of accepting for your sake." "You are very magnanimous and absurd," said Juliana, laughing. "And as for me, you have no idea what a quantity of methods of needlework Letitia Bentley and I learnt at school. So, if we have not enough to live upon..." "What is the matter?" For all at once the optimistic lover gave an exclamation and sprang to his feet. "Oh, I fear I go too fast," he said dejectedly. "Our countries are at war. I am your enemy, Juliana, and I am returning to fight once more against you over there. If every other difficulty were gone, how could we marry each other in such conditions? For I would never consent to leave you behind in England when you were my wife, and I could not well take you to France, even if you wished it. The gaiety of a moment ago was struck from him, and the triumph. He looked tired and tragic. Juliana got up and placed her hand on his arm. "No war lasts forever, dear enemy," she said consolingly. "Even this will end some day. We must wait, that is all." Raoul put his lips to the little hand. "Oh, I would wait till next century for you. But it needs two to wait, mon cœur. And while you wait for me... Ah, ciel, who am I that I should demand such a thing? And you will meet so many other men, rich, and of your own nation, 1,000 times better matches than I. Though hardly of a better family," he added, with a little lift of the head. "And you will regret... Oh, I ought not to ask it." "But what if it is I who ask it of you?" returned Juliana in her soft tones. "You, who have gone to prison for my sake, and were ready to return to it in its worst form for Captain Barrington's. Surely you are too chivalrous to refuse me that." "Oh, Raoul," she went on, shaking her head at him, "why did you fear that I would not understand when you decided to throw your freedom behind you yesterday? Why, it is a habit with you. I'm used to it. You did it again at Norman Cross, when you sacrificed yourself rather than fail your comrades. Yes, I've come these last months to see what you are. Much better, I know, than you see it yourself." As if ashamed, Raoul had put a hand over his eyes. "Mon Dieu, I do not know through what spectacles of rose-colour you look," he said indistinctly. "Vous rêvez. Je ne suis pas comme ça." And then suddenly he turned on her, his voice shaking slightly. "Are you sure that this is not all a dream, Juliana? That you wish really to take that journey with me? For if it is a dream, do not let me go on dreaming. Make it end quickly." Juliana took his two hands and folded them for a moment in her own, as once in prison. And, looking gravely at each other, they both saw, perhaps, glimpses of the long road they should eventually travel together. Then, gently, his arms went round her, and the kiss of Norman Cross was repaid in full. End of section 29. End of Mr. Rowl by D.K. Broster.